trying to practice looking at the actual camera instead of.
Oh my gosh, I'm like, all the screenshots, I'll seem like I'm cross-eyed probably.
Yeah.
Alrighty, folks, we've just opened up the webinar here. I hope you can hear me okay. Yes?
Yes.
Awesome, great. So good afternoon and welcome to Writers Reads, today featuring Doreen St, Félix and Haley Mlotek in conversation. We're so pleased to have you here with us today. We're coming to you live from Concordia University's ForSpace, located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. At ForSpace, we facilitate daily activities that focus on what Concordia community members and their collaborators are working on, especially in terms of research, various classroom activities, as well as initiatives. We're super happy to have been invited by Sina, who's here today with us as well, Sina Kira, to take part in Writers Read this semester. I'll remind you that it is a webinar. We have activated the chat, so for those of you joining us via Zoom, somebody's monitoring, Laura is here monitoring the chat, so feel free to drop any comments in there throughout. And of course, there's a dedicated question period at the end as well. So if you want to speak, you can just raise a virtual hand. We'll go ahead and unmute you so that you might speak to our guest today, or the Q&A and chat are activated. And for those of you behind me in the space today, welcome in. So happy you could join us. Once again, if you'd like to jump into the conversation, just raise your hand here in the space and we'll get a mic to you so that the folks on Zoom can hear you. All right, folks, on that note, it's my pleasure to pass it over to Laura for a proper introduction. Welcome.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome. I'm Laura Mota, one of Writers Read assistants, and today I have the pleasure to introduce Haley Mlotek and Doreen St. Félix. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I introduce Haley and Doreen, I would like to first go over some November events that you'll have with Writers Read. Next Thursdays at noon, Writers Read presents Lauren Elkin and Danielle Bobker with the presence of our director, Sina Keiras. On November 15th at 8 p.m., we'll receive George Abraham, Eli Tarek El-Beshalani Lynch, and Alexei Perry-Cox in conversation. On November 18th at 1 p.m., Writers Read presents Rana Towell. And for our last event on November 19th, Writers Read, in collaboration with the History Department, will present Anjuli Fatima Raza Kolb and Nicole Razia Fong. And all links for registration are in our link tree at Writers Read. And you can also see the posts updates on our social media at Writers Read Concordia on Instagram and CU Writers Read on Twitter. So you have yours.
Don't forget Caroline Birdwell
in December.
Yes, December 1st.
Yeah, did you? Yes.
Just wanted to say that.
Okay. So, thank you, Sina. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Doreen St. Félix. Doreen has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2017 and was named the magazine's television critic in 2019. Previously, she was a culture writer at MTV News. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Vogue, The Fader, and Pitchfork. In 2017, she was a finalist for a National Magazine Award for columns and commentary. And in 2019, she won in the same category. And now I'll introduce Haley. Haley Mlotek is a writer, editor, and organizer. Her works appeared in countless renowned magazines and newspapers all over the world. She's currently a senior editor at Sense, and the 2019-2020 co-chair of the Freelance Solidarity Project, a distinct division for digital media workers within the National Writers Union. Previously, Haley was the style editor of MTV News, the editor of The Harpin, and the publisher of One Fashion Journal. Her first book, about romance and divorce, will be published by Viking Books and MC Sealand and Stewart. And now I'll pass the mic to Haley.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Laura and Sina and everybody in Fourth Space. Thank you for attending either in person or virtually. I am so excited to be here today with you and to have this opportunity to speak with Doreen about her work as a writer. Doreen and I first met several years ago, and I have been so lucky to edit her at I think every job I've had since then. She is, to me, the absolute model of a critic. I just think her curiosity and insight and inherent brilliance are so heightened by her poise and her grace and her impeccably distinct style. Her sentences are breathtaking in the truest sense of the word. I really feel them right here. And the ideas they contain always illuminate the subjects they cover. I often think about her profile of Jeremy O. Harris in a recent issue of Essence, because there was one question in it where she just asked him very simply and directly if he was in love. And there was something about reading that for the first time that to me had the feeling of true radiance. You know, it was like a spotlight on the stage. And that's her quality of attention and sensitivity of emotion, which is such a gift to all of her readers. So thank you, Doreen. And we are going to start today by hearing her read some of her work. I understand you prepared a little something.
I have. I actually decided I had prepared something and then I thought it wasn't completely ready yet. So I'm going to read from something a bit older, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. And thank you so much, Haley, for that really beautiful and thoughtful introduction. I feel it right here. So this is from an essay that was published in August of 2018 during it's 2 years after America democratically elected a dictator. You might know of him, Donald Trump. And one of the people in his circle published a book that was meant to be a tell-all of some sorts. And that person was Omarosa, who had met Trump as a contestant on The Apprentice and all that. And yeah, this is an essay that I suppose it could be categorized under the idea of a book review, but it kind of spins out from that framing. So I thought I would read a little bit from it. I won't be able to read it all, but it'll just give you a taste. Unhinged, an insider's account of the Trump White House, the new dish from Omarosa Manigault Newman, is, in spirit and substance, a formality. Functionally, the book is meant to whisk its maker to her preferred platform, talk television, where she can dole out the beefier takeaways in real time. On Meet the Press, she produced a recording straight from the Situation Room of John Kelly, the White House Chief of Staff, firing her from her mysterious role as the Director of Communications for the Office of Public Liaison. On the Today Show, she brandished a recording of President Trump reacting to that firing. Moving from network to network, she touts a long-rumored tape of Trump saying "nigger" on the set of The Apprentice, as though it were the elixir that would cure tolerance of the intolerable. Her motivation, she says, is patriotism, but her mercenary career is well known. In short, you don't really need to read Unhinged, which recalls Carrie Bradshaw bloviating at her desk at midnight. I had to wonder, if Trump used the N-word so frequently during that first season of the show, had he ever used it to refer to either Kwame or myself? Much of the book's information is mundane, already reported on or unsubstantiated. The arc turns on an inane semantic argument that there is a difference between being a racist, racial, and someone who racializes. And the fact that, coincidentally, right around the time Omarosa had to find a new gig, she realized Trump was a racist. We zoom through the barrens of what Manigault Newman calls Trump world, chronicling the Apprentice years, the campaign, and the White House. Manigault Newman claims that applicants to The Apprentice were tested for STDs and that female prospects were subjected to a humiliating vaginal examination and pap smear. She claims that on the set of The Celebrity Apprentice, Trump egged Gene Simmons on as he hit on Ivanka. She claims that Trump bullied Sean Spicer and Michael Cohen, that he has never read an entire piece of policy, that he has often called Donald Trump Jr. a fuck up, and that he is in mental decline. Manigault Newman's selling point is that she has intimate, historic insight into the Trump family, insight one can't get from Michael Wolff's Fire and Fury or from Anthony Scaramucci's forthcoming blitz, Trump, the blue-collar president. But she can't seem to choose between dressing herself as a bushy-tailed mentee whose abstracted loyalty precludes her from seeing the misogyny and racism of her mentor, or a savvy career woman who was willing to play dirty to get ahead. Gone is the conviction of every critic, every detractor will have to bow down to President Trump. Now, when I look at things, she says, I'm stunned that I was involved in this kind of shady dealing. She writes of dropping a lawsuit against the National Enquirer at Trump's behest. The Enquirer, she claims, sent a reporter to surveil the funeral of her brother Jack, who was murdered in 2011. She also claims that Trump brokered a solution. Manigault Newman would serve as the West Coast editor in exchange for letting the matter go. To deliver palace intrigue, you must be well placed in the court. Unhinged is obsessed with showing how Manigault Newman, whose critics said did nothing in the administration, was in fact a key presence. Resume inflation has long been in the Omarosa playbook. She debuted in the early aughts by exaggerating her positions under Al Gore and the Clintons. Here, she goes further. She wants to prove that before Trump betrayed her, she was his one true confidant. She claims that when she suspected officials of being leakers, including the senior aide Katie Walsh, she told Trump and he fired them. When Betsy DeVos, who she claims Trump called Ditzy DeVos, attempted to block her from doing outreach with historically Black colleges and universities, Trump lifted all obstructions. I became physically repulsed reading Manigault Newman recounting Laura Trump and then Ivanka and Jared Kushner calling her after her firing, telling her that they loved her. When people try to understand the dynamic between Donald and me, it begins with shared triumph, she writes. This comes 2 paragraphs after she relays a comment Trump made to her after she was fired on The Apprentice. Can I be honest? He said. I almost consider you a friend. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. It was so wonderful to hear you read it. I always love like the cadence that writers give to their own work. I'm going to try and remember to look at the cameras. Sorry, I keep looking at you on the screen. But I wanted to start at the very beginning. I wanted to know how writing found you or how you found writing.
Absolutely. Well, I really am one of those saps who was kind of just born to do it, not because I had any innate gift, but because I couldn't do anything else. I was an impulsive, compulsive reader as a child. But I do have to say that I didn't understand that writing was a profession. I understood that it might be a curse, something that you feel like you have to do no matter what, but I didn't realize that there was actually steps that you could take in order to be in the writer's world as it exists, you know, on the thing that you see on your W-2, W-9. And so I'd say that it was something I nurtured in spite of the fact that I knew I probably wouldn't be able to do it professionally. I didn't come from the kinds of families that professional writers tend to come from. I didn't have initially the pedigree that I imagined people at Harper's and these magazines had. And so I think kind of strangely enough, they gave me the confidence to not follow a particular path. So I was someone who did it completely out of enthusiasm, out of it being a hobby. which is to say, when I went to college, I edited the newspaper, and all of my friends were getting these amazing unpaid internships at various companies that may or may not employ me right now. And I was like, okay, this is not an option for me. So I know it sounds a bit charmed, but when I graduated, I really wasn't thinking about being a professional writer. I actually was working as a piano teacher for some time. So I think of writing, at least in the professional sense, as this world that can be kind of obscured and half hidden if you don't have the skeleton key. And that world was not made intelligible to me until I was in my mid-20s.
Absolutely. And that's something we've spoken a lot about in the class that I'm teaching right now, that skeleton key that you mentioned, because it's one of those concepts where it absolutely does exist. And at the same time, it is a myth, right? Like the deeper you get into the industry, you realize that everybody has a story about some way that they like worked their own path into it outside of these traditional like legacies and institutions that you were referencing. I'm wondering if there was any moment early on where you felt something unlocked, if you met somebody, or if you had an assignment, or if there was just like an early piece of writing that you returned to as something that functions as maybe a before and after.
That's a really interesting question. I think I had two moments. The first was actually just harken back to a piece of writing that I did. And it was actually for MTV News, where you were one of my brilliant. And it was about Trump again. And it was this piece of criticism that was doing a kind of public musicology. Like I mentioned, I studied music for many years. And so at MTV News, I had this weird freedom to perform an analysis that you probably actually do need like a PhD to do, but that's the beauty, I think, of internet writing. And that was a moment where I felt myself exerting what felt like expertise. And it didn't feel, there was always a feeling of not quite it being a pejorative, but I always understood myself as a blogger. And that was one piece of writing that I was like, oh, whatever categorization we've created that seems to intimate value, this piece is maybe an essay. And it's something that its shelf life will be more than like 2 weeks. So that was a turning point for me. And then a second time was I was doing a really tiny story for Vogue. And I reached out to Margot Jefferson as a secondary. It was a profile of a hair artist. And I only reached out to her because I wanted to hang out with her. There was no need for Margot Jefferson to give. Margot Jefferson is an incredible literary critic and essayist who for some time was a theater critic at the Times. I had no reason to reach out to her beyond just wanting to talk to her. And I just sent an email and she was like, come to the Upper West Side. And we ended up having wine together and French fries. And we talked for 3.5 hours. And that was a moment when I think the social component of this world also was demystified. I was like, if Margot Jefferson is interested in meeting with young writers, people who have idolized her, then clearly I shouldn't feel, I shouldn't keep myself from interacting with these people who I've only ever known on the page.
Absolutely. And I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but that is also something that we focus on a lot in our class, which is that writing is often very isolating and very alienating. There's this myth as well of the writer who works alone at their keyboard or their typewriter or whatever, very romantic. But it can get very lonely very fast. And at the same time, writing, I often feel at its best, is so much in conversation with other writers as much as other readers. Like you say, it has the social component. So I was going to ask you if there are any writers maybe working today or ever who you feel like your work is always in conversation with. Margot Jefferson is such a good one.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm going to take it down a notch and not say in conversation because I don't want to overstate where I might be in this order if you believe in hierarchies. But I think for just every woman who considers an essayist who has been born in the past century, I think Virginia Woolf is like really our center, our compass, just even the notion of a woman having the space, whether we mean financial, physical, or psychological, to produce writing is that's what modernity is. And so I just remember reading On Being Ill, which is her essay about why illness and sickness is not one of the great themes of literature. I remember reading that when I was 17, and it was just like, if I can create like a sentence that is like one of these sentences in this multi-thousand word essay, that would be, could just die right then and there. So there's Woolf, but in terms of contemporary or people who are just a little bit older than me, Greg Tate was a huge influence on me. He was a critic at the Village Voice, the original Village Voice. I think there might be a zombie version working right now. But he is very instrumental in the way we think about music and the way we talk about music. And he has this incredible essay, I think from 1986. It's called The Cult Gnats, and it's about sort of like a vision. How can we envision the Black public intellectual who didn't go to Harvard, who didn't have a pedigree in this way, and see their experience as a kind of expertise as opposed to having to be edified by the institution. Hilton Alls is someone who I read religiously growing up. Rachel Kadziganza is very influential to me in the way that she melds and maybe even melts the border between what we consider to be classic criticism, what we consider to be reporting. I'm thinking of the Profile, but it's much more than that. She did a Dave Chappelle, excuse me, in The Believer. Yeah, Patricia Lockwood is someone who I also think of. She's someone who I do feel like is a contemporary and has maybe salvaged humor and given humor a place in. I think the humor is a way of connecting that has been long looked down upon in American letters in particular, to the point that people don't even think to realize that someone like Thoreau is actually very funny in a lot of his essays. And she's someone who I think of as doing literary analysis in that tradition. Ellen Willis, I don't even really agree with where she was always coming from, but she's sort of one of those unavoidable, I would say, figures in modern cultural criticism. I want to mention James Baldwin, but not in the way that he tends to be mentioned. He was someone who I was lucky to come across first as an aesthete. I read The Devil Find Work when I was maybe 18 years old. And this is like a really short book of cultural criticism, but it's all about film. And Baldwin is really interesting because he's a figure who was born at the genesis of the birth of a new art form. And a lot of his film criticism is so fascinating because you're watching someone interact with like a completely invented medium, that essentially shaped the way he saw himself in a way that we take for granted. I mentioned Marco Jefferson. Gia Tolentino is also someone who I often feel like I'm in dialogue with. There's probably more, but those are people who come up.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned The Devil Finds Work because I actually just assigned it as reading last week. So I hope everyone read it. Yeah, we read the section on The Exorcist as well as Letter from a Region in My Mind. And we talked about that crossover where criticism is not necessarily something that comes from the personal, but the personal shapes it so much, like the subjective reading as being so informed by what one person can bring to an art form and what it means to give gravity, I guess, to the work of an artist. So maybe, there are so many things I want to talk to you about, but maybe I'll go to criticism specifically because, in your current position as the television critic at The New Yorker, I really think of you as somebody who is such a model of the way you apply fairness in your critiques and the way that's such a sign of respect for the artists and the work that they do. In this class, we've talked a little bit about maybe the inflation that happens in criticism around digital media, especially where everything has to be the very best or everything's the very worst. And oftentimes it can feel hard to find your balance. I'm wondering how you think about that in the process of maybe first looking at a work of art as a critic. Like, is it something that you're very mindful of at the beginning, or is it that the deeper you get into understanding a work of art, the more you feel, like a leveling or a balancing that you apply in your writing?
That's such an interesting question. And I think if anything is the modern struggle, I think for a lot of writers who initially built their careers online, is that it's not to say that we are completely controlled by the algorithm, but you have a sense of SEO, you have a sense of what opinions. I mean, one of the biggest engines on earth is literally just people shouting opinions at each other, that being Twitter, Facebook, Meta, Meta, you can include as well. And I have to say that I feel that ambiguity is one of the strongest reactions that you can have to something, or ambivalence even. And what is always in the back of my mind, I became a television critic like 2 months before the pandemic. And that was an interesting time because the idea of what TV could do for us was overinflated, right? Because people didn't really have other ways to socialize. And so the television, something that as a physical entity doesn't even really exist anymore. Your phone is your TV, your laptop is your TV. All of a sudden, these like weird post-World War ideas of the TV box being the sacred center of, family connection, that was returning, but in our warped century, in our way of making everything ironic. And so I quickly realized that being a TV critic would necessarily mean working outside of the text and working with the way opinion becomes inseparable from watching television, more so than any other medium, like even more so than film. Maybe the film Twitter bros in attendance will get mad at me. But television these days just like it contains its own criticism, or it contains its own like reactionary energy. So I feel like I've been operating from a place of, I feel like I'm very lucky to be able to get away with not having these like strong pull quotes that will then bring a lot of traffic to the website. And I'm aware that that's because it's a privilege to have a column in a magazine where, you're fairly safe. And I just, more often than not, the older I get, I'm still 29. I think of the ways, the distance or the gap, or maybe even it's bigger than a gap, between what we actually feel, our emotions, the messiness of them, the grayness of them, and how we vocalize them, which is to say that anyone who says that a show is the best show they've ever seen doesn't actually believe that. That's just their way of communicating whatever emotion the show gave them, whether it was pleasure, whether they were aroused by it. And I'm much more interested in like conveying what sensuality really is when we are consuming these things that are being made in a commercial context, which is what makes critiquing television difficult. It's art, but it's art for a profit. But also critiquing a medium that is not like film or literature, and that there's not a canon of criticism surrounded by it. As much as I'm assuming everyone here has an interest in television, I don't think that television is at all considered to be on the same tier as some of our older art forms. So it's a struggle, but I just try to be like as true to my feelings, even if my feelings are unresolved or complicated or any of those things.
Absolutely.
I'm all about feelings.
Thank you. And it was so wonderful to hear you describe it that way, because to me, I feel like that just unlocked so much of what I've felt about your work, but it was maybe something that, was just sort of seen or like felt and I wasn't able to articulate. But yeah, like that sensuality specifically that you describe, as well as you were talking, I was realizing, yeah, television has a lot to lose. It feels like the stakes have been raised so much in these last few decades, where it's like being seen as up against these other older art forms that you mentioned that have a critical canon behind them, but is constantly in the process of proving why they even deserve it, right? And then, yeah, like you say, the pandemic, I don't know, I remember feeling like there is such high stakes involved with everyone watching the same Netflix show at the same time, or it's like, or what were you going to talk about in your daily 10 a.m. Zoom or whatever?
Right. And also the notion of what television is also something that's being constantly broken and reconstituted. Is YouTube television? Are Instagram stories television? So I think we're at a time of, it's just a really interesting time to me where the category is very unstable, and I'm interested in further theorizing about that lack of stability.
Absolutely. And so that's, such a beautiful way of looking at the art itself. I'm wondering too, if when you're writing, do you ever think about, I guess, like who the reader is specifically rather than, like the audience or the demographic, but is there a person in your mind that you're always writing towards?
Yeah, it's funny. Because I write for a magazine that has been around for nearly a century, maybe this is going to sound a bit simple, but I just imagine, someone who's like slightly distracted on the subway, maybe in their 40s, maybe in their 50s, just has read a long piece of incredibly meticulous reporting and gets to what is not the fluff of the magazine, but it is the area of the magazine where the moral center is not as activated, right? I am not unaware that people receive a feeling of importance by reading magazines in this day and age, in particular because they're becoming more and more endangered. And I think the New Yorker sort of represents those complicated feelings that the bourgeoisie has about having their opinions telegraphed back at them. So I'm not skeptical of my imagined reader, but I understand that my imagined reader has a system in their lives that dictates their taste. And writing about television, I'm really just like in the morass of the taste wars. Everyone has their opinions about reality television and how the idea of exploitation is really centered in the medium. So this person that I have in my mind, I always imagine myself kind of just like needling them a little bit or kind of poking them in the ribs to see if they might move a little bit, even if it's a few inches away from their expectation of what it is that they should like.
Absolutely. And yeah, we were talking earlier about the way digital media has influenced media across the board, and maybe this like false hierarchy that exists about what it means to write for a blog, what it means to write for a magazine. But something that I think is so critical to remember about that very recent history is that the television recap is such a huge part of blogging, right? Like it was really how so many of these digital media publications established themselves and sort of set a standard for, I think, some of that inflation that we've seen in terms of critical things. So I really like the way you describe, wanting to deserve somebody's attention, like understanding that people come to it with their own maybe baggage or opinions or ideas, and seeing it as an offering rather than maybe like, I don't know, a lecture or something like that. It's just a starting point.
Right, exactly. Or even a crucible. I think that unfortunately we have a society where something as small as a television show can spiral and become the weather vane through which people create their friendships, through which they date. It's all kind of in the same matrix. And so I feel like I'm in this kind of weird position where I'm both trying to take the art very seriously, but I'm understanding that our reactions to it are in some ways unserious. That doesn't mean that it's not worth value. It's not worth, excuse me, exploring or dissecting our reactions to the thing.
Yes, but I often feel very freed by reminding myself that it's not that deep. And that's a good thing, right?
I should have said that.
But that, like, that something can be pleasurable, that something can be shared, that something can be enjoyed, or it can just be experienced, and that's okay. In a similar but slightly off-track way, as your Twitter bio says, you've written for a lot of places. And so in the same way that there's like different gravities given to different art forms, I'm curious to know how you feel your writing maybe change or evolve when you are working with different editors or different publications. How the shape that the writing will ultimately take when it's published changes the experience for you.
That's a great question. Also, I'm sorry, we were talking about writers in solitude and quiet, and of course my neighbors are blasting music. I hope it's not too distracting.
No, I didn't notice. There's skateboarders going by,
Oh, okay.
We're in the big cities.
Humanity rolls on. But yeah, so I was very self-conscious when I initially started writing, because I felt that people maybe didn't even pay attention to the byline at all, that they were much more interested in the website or the magazine as like a fortress that would safeguard all of their ideas, and that writers who hadn't yet reached the perch of fame were just people who were keeping that fortress fortified. And MTV News was kind of an interesting time because we were working at this, it was interesting for a lot of reasons. But we were working at this website that did not have a cultural identity, really. Like, it was a website that was known for just aggregating celebrity news. And through that absence, or through that superfluity, we were able to kind of just say, hey, this is how you're going to interact with this publication. And obviously, I think the esteem that the editors who were hired, like one editor, Haley Mlotek, and other people brought to the website, you can sort of see people forming their opinions on whether or not they're going to take the work seriously, based on that external stuff. And I think for me, it's gotten much easier as I've grown more confident in my voice. But voice is the element that I find is the most vulnerable to changing when I'm working with editors, because I really embrace the editing process. But I think it's Toni Morrison. She has this amazing quote about how the editor and the writer are supposed to have a dispassionate relationship. The writing should come above the quirks and kinks of human relationship. And that's the thing I find challenging, but in a way that I know will pay its dividends over and over again. And so the development of my voice and my style has often been in that place of struggle, in that place of learning when it is to advocate for the cadence of a sentence or for the meat of an idea, and also learning when actually this external voice is part of the piece. That person, I mean, and it's not always the case, but in the best scenarios, that person is your collaborator. And, the editor is not someone who, last century, the editor had some kind of prestige and esteem and importance, but that's kind of no longer the case. And so I try to keep that. I want to be attendant to what an editor can do for me, but I also think it's really important that you go against the grain and that you are bad sometimes. I don't think that necessarily being right on time with deadlines is like what you should be shooting for as a writer. I think you should be shooting for being interesting, and maybe being for a little bit difficult. I think of writers that I really admire, they were extremely difficult presences. And so I think that's the next phase of my career, is just learning to kind of fight for what it is that I know is not necessarily right, but is what I want to do, which I think is what writers should do. I don't think they need to be moral arbiters. I think they should do what they believe is right for where they are at any point in their lives.
Absolutely. I think that's so true, especially the point about how sometimes it's only in moments of tension that you can really find out what matters to you, or not even what matters, but why it matters.
Right.
Like I often feel like it's good for me to be forced to have to explain why a sentence has to stay in the piece, or why the structure was set up the way that I set it up, because so often I feel like that's maybe part of what feels isolating about writing, that it happens in your head, and that's a way of taking it out of the head beyond the sentence. Like, here's what led me to the sentence, or why I know it's what fits. Yeah, I just think that's such a beautiful way of putting it. And then, like, in the same way that you mentioned this relationship with the editor, we've also spoken a lot about other virtues of journalism. Like you mentioned, being on time, and like, of course, all of my students should always be on time and like submit clean copy. It is so important. I think especially when you're starting out, it's the type of thing you do because it's a sign of respect for a colleague, right? Because that's what an editor is when you're working together. But at the same time, it's often, just there because it represents something. It's symbolic. The symbolism has some meaning, but it's not as important as the writing itself. What are some virtues in writing that you think actually matter?
Oh, that's great. Well, I think we actually started this conversation off with the notion of being in conversation. I think having a citational ethic is just paramount. It's easy to privilege or chase or become obsessed with this notion of being original, but you should know that that's something you need to let go, because it is very, very rare that you will have a thought that was not thought before in human history. What you do have is a distinct style, and that's what you can develop. And it's sort of like finding different pathways to getting to observation that people have made hundreds and hundreds of times before. Like, that's what readers are actually much more interested in. Are you somebody who kind of like goes overhead and flies to get to the point, or do you go subterranean way into like understanding this idea? Or are you somebody is your style much more lyrical? Do you have one of those like severe brutalistic simplistic styles of writing? And so anytime I talk to peers or people who are even younger, I feel like voice and style is what really comes up. And once you have that, or once you're endeavoring to have that, you will find that you're much freer to say, of course, I have not come up with this argument. This person did, and the person did before that. And if anything, I bolster my essay by including their thought in it. And then this just sounds like really kind of unglamorous, but I just think the drafting process is really essential. It is basically not ever going to happen that you will write something in its first iteration and it will be the best version of what it is. I hate to get all, like a dictionary on us, but I know there are many French speakers in the house. And the etymology of essay is from the French verb essayer, to try. And failure you have to be willing to live with failure, to have it kind of be the shadow encircling your person, in order to make essays that feel like they are taking a real risk. It's really easy to write a beautiful essay that is quite safe. And I think that risk is something that all writers should journey towards. And I understand that that feels scary for so many reasons right now, aesthetically and personally, but also politically. We are living in a time where risk has been perverted. But I think that's really, in my mind, that's the only thing that makes any of this worth doing.
Absolutely. And it's a whole other question about whether or not writing is an art or writing is work, or how and where it exists as both. But I do, for myself personally, I think of writing as an art because I think of an artistic practice as one that's very humbling, like you're always admitting that you're falling short of what you pictured in your mind. And so the concept of trying is, to me, so defined by contributing, right? Like you were saying about how it's not necessarily about being first, but being in a position to build on what already exists, to maybe that's as grandiose as I'm willing to go, to be like, maybe I could carry this an inch further than where it stood before I picked it up, but it's going to have to be somebody after me who keeps moving it even more inches. Yeah.
Or it might even be you at a different stage in your life. I think also, unfortunately, the professionalization of the arts has created this terrible legend, boogie monster of the prodigy who did everything by the age of 27 years old. And I've also gotten caught up in that thirst, because I was someone who got writing jobs when I was really young. I'm still really young. But I think that the best years in your life are not your 20s, at least not when it comes to the art. Maybe dating, romance, it's different. But, if we believe in time, and if we live thinking that there is more time to be had, I think remembering that you don't have to do everything all at once is really essential. You might create your best work in your 50s or your 60s, and that still will be, who will care? No one will care that this essay was published when you were 27 versus when you were 57. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, age is another great example of something that has a symbolic value rather than maybe an actual one, because it's remarkable when somebody is so young and so brilliant. But you want to act as if you have the real luxury, which is time, time to think and to grow. Are there maybe stories or ideas that you hope to return to sometime soon, or, in the not too distant future?
That's an amazing question. So yeah, television is something that I'm writing about right now. Out of something like love, but not obsession. I'm not a television obsessive, and that's why it's been a really interesting experiment for me, because it's involved having to learn a canon that isn't even really a canon per se. And so I find it really fascinating, but I don't imagine myself as being a career television critic. But the idea I'm always circling around is race and performance. And so I'm really interested in getting to a place where I would have both the time and maybe even the space to go much longer on what feels like is a true obsession of mine. And it still comes up in the writing, of course, because television is really subconsciously about race, our notion of representation, who can be seen. But yeah, I would love to, in some longer form, and maybe that's not even the written word per se, it could be other mediums. I'd like to contribute more to the thinking that we have about race and performance in this century.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, what I often say, like the cliche that writing is rewriting, that, your first version is never your best version, but you need to get it out in order to get to that perfect sentence. Are there any other maybe notes you've received from editors or craft techniques that you've picked up over the years that you constantly return to that you would want to share with the students?
Absolutely. So I had an editor with whom I had the most intense relationship, and she used to say this thing. She used to say it neutrally, but there was a current of judgment underneath it that was quite necessary for me at the time. But she would read a sentence and she'd be like, "Are you trying to be clever?" And it's a sort of comment that makes you very defensive. And who isn't that what writing is about, trying to be clever? But what she was really trying to say is that, are you indulging past the point of indulgence being attractive or valuable to the writing? And I think that that's something that it's hard to define, but when you encounter it in published writing, you know it immediately. It's just something that is excessive, but not it's a sort of indulgence that if you had a reader, they would just like tell you that it's not necessary. And if anything, it kind of weakens the work that you're trying to do. So I love indulgence and I love being excessive, but I try to have it have a purpose. Other things are, I find it's been really useful to not think of the essay as a work that has to be done in linear order, or that linearity is not something that has to rule the essay as a form. I think that's often where a lot of writers get stuck. And I found that kind of in the opposite way, because I work in a magazine and that really is a professional venture. And the essays always have to be linear. Like if you're referencing the date, the earliest date has to come in the beginning. You know, you have to tell the story from the beginning. And I don't think that's something that I do for my job, and I'm fine doing it for my job, but I don't think it's something that has to dictate my writing life outside of it. So I've learned a lot of rules that I'm kind of breaking now, and it feels really, it's a hacky word to use, but liberating, which is to say the essay form, there are rules that can be broken and I think can bring you closer to the voice, which is something that is, it's the eternal struggle of being a writer, is just trying to get comfortable and knowledgeable with what your voice is. And to do that, you have to do a lot of imitating, you have to do a lot of reading, and you have to do a lot of breaking of that imitation and breaking of the rules that your idols have created for you. So some rules I've taken with me and other rules I've decided to leave by the wayside, but they've all been really important relationships to me with my editors.
Absolutely. And how are we doing for time, Laura? What time is it now? Okay, so maybe we should open it up to questions.
Perfect.
Good. Should we do, maybe we'll do one from somebody here and then go to the chat? If anybody has a
Perfect.
question? Yeah. I can't see the people on the other side of this. But does anyone have a question? I think so.
Hello? Okay. Go around.
Who's it gonna be?
Okay. Hi, Doreen. Thanks so much for coming. Haley earlier had mentioned your level of attention, and I realized that a lot in your work. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit to the process of translating the attention into the work. And I'm sure that comes down to drafting and kind of getting it all out. But if you could just say a bit about that. Thank you.
That's a great question. I think when we talk about attention, we're really talking about pathologies, which is to say I probably have obsessive tendencies. And I would say that what happens with every published piece is that there are like 15 unpublished pieces behind it, which is to say that I actually just accrue a very large amount of writing during the time that I'm doing it. And a lot of that is not, it's not writing that could be read by the public per se. It's just like notes that are jotted down kind of haphazardly. But yeah, the published piece is just like, this is a tired visual, but it's the writing that is just the tip of the iceberg. And there's all that like crap and good stuff and mediocre stuff underneath it that needs to be processed in order for that essay, that thing that gets close to gleaming, for that to exist. And so I'd say it's just a matter of being on all the time and being unafraid of, I think when we think of prolific writers, we think of people who have published a lot, but that might not necessarily be the case for you. Being prolific might mean giving a lot of your attention to watching films or reading and, writing down what your opinions and your thoughts and your observations of those things are. So I think for me, when I think of attention, it's not just even about experiencing or watching these things, but not being afraid to write down my reactions to them, even if I know that they won't necessarily have a home in the published sense. So that's kind of I don't know if that's a direct answer to your question, but that's what came to mind.
So we have a question from Colin. Colin asks, what other writing genres have you explored and how has that influenced your approach to journalism?
That's a great question. I think for me, I'm sure in your classes you talk about the genesis of new journalism, the idea that features would have something more to do with the spirit of a novel than a piece of hard reporting. I think every writer of my generation has been influenced by prior journalists' metabolization of the novel. But I think for me, it's not even so much writing genres that also influence me, it's other mediums. So film is probably the film is the animal that's always in my mind when I'm writing an essay, especially when I have the space to write unconventional essays, which are not what reviews are. I mean, you can find ways to make them feel unconventional, but the form is in the name. A review has to do certain work. But film, when I watch a film and it gets me thinking differently about temporality, that I think has affected the changes in my style over the past couple of years. So it's interesting. I think there are a lot of cinephiles who are also writers. Writing is a lot cheaper than making a film. So yeah, that's the other, it's not a genre, but it's the different thing that has affected the work that I do.
Do we have other questions from the attendees?
I think there are a few more. Yes. Oh, yeah.
Hi, Doreen. Thank you so much for joining me, or not just me, but this whole room. But yeah, thanks for your wonderful insights, and Haley for also being in conversation. I have kind of a long question, so I'm gonna try and read off my phone, but I apologize that might not look very aesthetically pleasing. So last year, I went to a virtual talk titled Beyond Representation Towards a Counter-Poetics in Black Image and Filmmaking with Ayanna Dozer, who's an artist and performance and filmmaker. She completed her PhD in art history and communication studies at McGill. And in the talk, Dozer was discussing the significance of analyzing Black filmmaking through aesthetics and honing in on lighting, angles, and sound rather than focusing on representation. So I thought about Dozer a lot when I was reading your article, The Achievement of Barry Jenkins, The Underground Railroad, and how you wrote, "We have known Jenkins, the director of Moonlight, as a portraitist." And further down the page, you wrote, "Jenkins lets the camera rest on their faces, a signature move, but here the shot is edged with something earthy rather than beatific." And so I was wondering how you decide what filmmaking aesthetics you want to convey and capture for your reader when you're watching TV.
That's a great question. So it's also complicated because some television is made to activate the parts of us that feel like we're looking at something cinematic. So with someone like Barry Jenkins, you sort of can't avoid the aesthetic question because he himself has made it, he's put it at the foreground of the way the work is processed and the way that it's built. And so there's no unifying rule for me because if I'm watching an HBO Max show that obviously has a cinematographer behind it and there is an intelligence behind it, but it's not necessarily trying to do something that feels beyond the kind of course, then I maybe will focus on that a little less in the writing. And so a lot of the television that I have to write about is not necessarily trying to do anything visually innovative. In fact, part of what makes television is that it doesn't veer from those tropes because of the market and all these other forces. And so it puts you in a weird position where it's like, how do you write about the lack of innovation, which is to say the traditionalism of the medium, but very obviously is very different. And part of that is because he is a film director who has come to work in television. And this is a really intense argument among a lot of critics, the notion that if something is long or it has a more powerful aesthetic presence, maybe it shouldn't even be considered television, even if it is being published on the medium. There are some people who would love to argue that, for example, Steve McQueen's series that he did for BBC, the Small Axe series, is not television only because a filmmaker made it. Steve McQueen is also one of the people who wants to argue that it's not television, whereas I would say actually it is because of the medium where it appears. So ultimately, I think critics sometimes get stuck in the ease and repetition of separating representation and aesthetics. And part of that is because Blackness has been reduced to representation for so long. However, if we're being honest and true, the two exist with each other in a very complicated relation. And so I'm someone who also says that, hey, I would like to, privilege talking about the aesthetics of a film that is made by a Black artist, but by saying that, I'm also sort of ignoring the way that all of the elements in a film have to work together. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest crises for Black artists in this day and age, is being able to work with both of those things in mind, representation and aesthetics.
So the next question is from Dora. Dora asks, though many have speculated on the death of personal essays, do you think they still have popularity and readership today? Can they complement the current iteration of developing popular political discourse? Dara also asks tips on capturing atmosphere and emotion without being too wordy.
So I guess I'll work backwards. I don't think wordiness is a problem. I think that so long as the writing justifies it, you can use a lot of words to describe something that's incredibly difficult or layered or complicated. It's just about having the discernment to know if those words are actually doing any work, which sometimes they're not doing. And usually when you sleep on it and you do something terrible to yourself, which is reading the word aloud, it's like the most brutal thing you can do to yourself. You'll see which words don't belong. But what you're describing is exegesis, right? Which is not so much putting down an opinion on the art, but explaining what the art is doing in a different art form. That's like the hardest thing to do as a critic. And then the idea that the personal essay is dead, I think that was a pronouncement that was made in response to a shift in digital media, which is to say certain websites that published a lot of personal essays were no longer functioning. And then that ended up informing what we call as a backlash, but actually was just the surfacing of an opinion that has always existed, which is to say the personal essay is like inherently less valuable. And also there's a bit of a dishonesty because a lot of what people publish, say in the New York Times opinion section, is actually just personal essays, but they're marketed, branded in a different way. And I just think that if you look at the kind of books that sell, like nonfiction, even just the way nonfiction has become really the dominant mode for books, you would find that the personal essay is not dead at all. It's just the moment that we had in the late aughts and the early 2010s where people had a compulsory relationship to sharing in that kind of like Quicksilver essay way, that has maybe changed. But if the personal essay is not something that you can like kill, it's the foundation of the essay as we know it in literary history. So yeah.
Thank you. Do we have questions in person? No? Okay. So we have a few in the chat.
We'll do maybe one more.
One more?
One more. Yeah.
Okay. So the last one will be from Sarah.
Okay.
Sarah asks, how formed are your thoughts before writing a piece? Does it often surprise you the way your thoughts can change on a subject as you're writing? Or does it tend to match your initial impression and goals when you were when you started the piece?
That's an amazing question. Obviously, the speed of the internet influences this interaction that the writer has with their thoughts. Throughout most of history, there was a lot of time between the genesis of a thought, its transfiguration into writing, and then that writing being even printed, if that was a possibility, and then shared with the masses. And so I think it's important to remember that this really compressed timeline that we're operating in is like really, really new. A lot of the writers that we valorize and invented our notion of what writing is did not exist under that pressure. I'm not saying that, you know, if I had more time, I'd be Montesquieu, but it's just true that we have a lot less time. But I also would say that I don't have deep attachment to my observations or even like arguments that I make about artworks. I'm much more moved and compelled by putting my thinking process on the page. And so it has become less frequent that I write a piece and I disagree with my opinion or my thought has changed after the publication of it, because I'm becoming less and less interested in handing down judgments. Obviously, I still do, but even if I have a judgment that is like maybe a little bit more strident than I tend to do, as long as the thinking process is interesting, that's like what I care about more. There's pieces I've read where I'm like, oh, I'm totally wrong. I actually did like this movie or whatever, but I'm interested in the way that my brain got to the point that it did. And as long as the thinking is there, which I think is something to remember, that like the best essays have the thinking in the piece. You can see the way the journey to the idea is being memorialized in the writing itself. That's my goal with the pieces that I publish. That would be called criticism. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that is it for us. We are going to wrap up. Whoops. Sorry. Doreen, thank you so much for joining us. I wish we could have done it in person, but another time soon.
Thank you so much, Haley. The questions were amazing. Your questions were amazing. Thank you to the Q&A. Yeah, and keep writing.
Please, we'll keep reading. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, For Space. Oh, yes. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks everybody for being here. We had this in our schedule from 3 to 5, so I just busted out of my office going, I thought we had another hour. I'm so sorry for that, but it's been a pleasure to listen to this conversation. And as we're seeing in the chat, everybody's very excited by this exchange. So thank you for your generosity of time and sharing your thoughts and ideas. And I'll just remind folks that we did live stream onto YouTube, so you can revisit these words on another time, another place, another date, another moment. So thanks everybody for being here. And on Zoom, I guess with that, we'll close up. Have a great evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.